Mixing drums is a lot easier than it seems. Following the steps that I'm showing here makes the process much more rewarding and less time consuming. So let's take a look at a complex drum session as we go through the ultimate drum mixing guide. Before we start, if you want to get the most out of your productions, check out our Sage Audio membership. It includes 50 masters a year performed by some fantastic engineers, access to the Sage Audio community for unlimited mix reviews, one-to-one mentorship, hours of educational courses, and so much more that for the sake of time, I'll cover at the end of the video. First, let's improve the phase relationships. So our session has 16 tracks, shortened and looped for the sake of hearing the before and after of the effects. It includes 2 overheads, 2 room mics, a crush mic, which is a heavily distorted mono recording, 3 mics on the kick, a snare top and bottom mic for both the toms, then a hi-hat and a ride. These were recorded in a studio, not sampled, but the concepts that I'm showing here could be applied to sampled drums as well. So here's how we improve the phase relationship between all these tracks. First, put a correlation meter on the stereo output. A stock plugin is going to work fine. Next, solo the overheads. Pan the left overhead to the left and the right overhead to the right. On the right overhead, insert a phase invert plugin. Your DAW should have a stock plugin for this, and then play the soloed overheads and observe the correlation meter. The closer that the meter is to +1, the better. The closer it is to -1, the more phase cancellation we have occurring between these two signals. Notice that when I invert the phase of the right overhead, the correlation and measured phase relationships become worse. This indicates to me that these two signals have the best phase relationship when the right overhead's phase is not inverted. Since I won't be inverting this track's phase, I could take the plugin off and then move on to the next track. I'll keep the first 2 tracks soloed while now also soloing the third track. The right overhead will join the left overhead by being panned to the left, and the newly soloed track will be panned to the right. Again, we'll play the soloed tracks and observe the correlation meter as we invert the phase of the newly soloed track. In this instance, inverting the phase is not helping either. So again, I'll remove the plugin, pan it to the left, solo the next track, pan that one to the right, and repeat the process for all tracks. The kick's boundary mic is the first track where I'm noticing it improves from being inverted. Notice that when I invert its phase, the correlation meter shows it's more positive. By the end of doing this, the kick boundary, the kick in, the snare top, the hi-hat, and the ride tracks needed to be inverted to improve the correlation. Now, of course, I'll keep those 5 tracks inverted, return everything to the center, and then achieve some general panning and levels. Let's take a listen to the before and after. The levels will be identical and the phase of those 5 tracks will be inverted. Let me know which one you think is inverted and which is the original in the comments. Next, let's remove any silence. The traditional way to do this is to use a gate, but I prefer to edit the track. If you use a gate to isolate the relevant signal and reduce track bleed, the plugin's downward expansion and general behavior will alter the track's timbre. However, editing typically avoids this. To use a gate, simply insert the gate of your choice and begin to adjust the threshold until the attenuation sounds natural. For drums, a hard knee setting works well on the kick, the snare, hi-hat, and toms, while more gradual gating works better on overheads, room mics, and cymbals. However, you might want to avoid gating these signals altogether. The method that I prefer includes opening up the editing window, and while affecting the track, not the file, bear in mind that that's important if you don't want to alter your audio permanently, and under Functions, select Remove Silence. Adjust the threshold until the relevant parts of the signal are isolated. Notice that I'm being more aggressive with the kick, the snare, and toms, but I'm using a lower threshold for the overheads, the rooms, and other similar tracks. For some tracks, it might be best just to leave them alone. Let's take a listen to the original drums, then the edited ones, and notice how the edited drums still sound natural, just a little more controlled. Now's a good time for EQ. So starting with the overheads, I'm going to use identical settings for both. Since we're dealing with a multi-tracked instrument, any changes to one signal will interact with another. For this reason, I've used the same very gradual low shelf and high shelf setting on the overheads, the room mics, the crush mic, the hi-hat, and the ride. Then I'll use identical EQ settings for each group, so to speak. So the 3 kick mics all get the same EQ, And it's the same for the snare mics, the high toms, and the floor tom. The 3 kick mics have a low shelf boost around 80 Hz, a dip around 400 Hz to reduce knocking, and a boost around 2 kHz to amplify the sound of the beater hitting the skin. The 2 snare mics have a 6 dB per octave slope high-pass filter centered right below the fundamental, which reduces unmusical lows. A subtle bell on the fundamental to increase the note in the tone, a dip to 400 Hz to reduce any knocking sound, and a moderate bell a little under 5 kHz to increase the snap and the clarity. The high tom mics have unmusical lows cut, the fundamental boosted, muddy frequencies reduced, that kind of basketball dribbling sound around 900 Hz reduced, and some clarity added around 4.5 kHz. Similarly, the floor tom has its fundamental boosted, muddy frequencies reduced around 250 Hz, that same 900 Hz tone reduced, and some clarifying high frequencies boosted, again around 4.5 kHz. Let's take a listen to the before and after. I'm not going to tell you which is which, but let me know in the comments which one has and which one hasn't been equalized. Next up, we'll introduce compression. So compression can get complicated pretty quick, but I use this incredibly simple method that I think sounds great. I'll stick to the 1176, preferably the Revision A with the blue faceplate, and achieve about 5 to 7 dB of attenuation on each track, with a few exceptions that I'm going to mention in just a moment. Now, here's where I lose a lot of people though. I always use the fastest attack and the fastest release settings on the drums. You could yell at me in the comments saying I'm killing the transients if that's what you want to do, but I've already converted a few very stubborn engineers into using this method. Now, conventional wisdom says to use a long attack to let the transient through, but when we cut into the transient, we distort it, amplifying the highs. Now, I think a lot of engineers simply flip between fast and slow settings and say, oh, the slow sounds better. But I'm guessing that's because they're not compensating for the up to 5 dB gain increase that a slow attack introduces. When you compensate for the gain changes, you'll hear how much better the distortion sounds than simply letting the transient through. I'm going to use this method for everything except the crush mic since it's already pretty smashed, the hi-hat and the ride, which are just going to bring up a lot of ambience, and I'll get about 3 dB of attenuation on the room mics instead of 6. Last thing to note, I'm going to start with a 4:1 setting for most of the signals, but I'll move to an 8:1 if I want some additional distortion. So let's listen to this compression being introduced. I'll show you one track that uses the slow attack setting and one that uses the fast attack setting, both compensated to have their peak levels as close as possible. I won't tell you which is which, but let me know which one sounds better to you. After compression, let's add some mild transient expansion. Now I know what you're thinking. He just said that this compression method doesn't squash the transients, yet here we are introducing some transient expanders. But honestly, transient expanders just sound good, and they're needed to get a snappy sound no matter what you do before or after them. So I'm going to add some mild expansion on the kick, the snare, and the toms. I'm using this Punctuate plugin, but I'm turning a lot of what's unique about the plugin off to keep things simple, so use whatever expander you have. All you have to do is use a low amount and dial in the time to encapsulate the transient best. Let's take a listen and notice how we're starting to get both a full and a snappy sound. Next comes duct reverb. So the snares, the toms, and the overall sound will quickly wash out if you don't duct the reverb on drum tracks. The same thing happens if you reverberate tracks that simply don't need it. So before I show you some reverb settings, avoid adding reverb to room mics, since that would kind of defeat their purpose, and any purposefully distorted tracks like the crush mic. Everything else can have very intentionally dialed in reverb. On the overheads, I recommend a high density, low frequency reverb. Then use a ducker to attenuate the start of the reflections and let the transient pass through unaffected. The longer the release time, the drier the sound, so this will take some dialing in while listening to the full mix to get a good idea of the interaction between everything. On the kick, I recommend a kick chamber preset, something with a short RT60 and a good amount of low frequencies. Again, duck the hit and time the release to the song or to what simply sounds best. On the snare, you could try a snare plate and adjust the decay time until it fits the style in the genre. Again, Duck the hit, this time more aggressively, before blending in the amount to suit the track. Toms sound great with dense reflections like those found in an echo chamber, but with an adjusted reverb time of 1 second. The same is true for the floor tom, but with a reverb time of about 1.5 seconds. Again, we're ducking the hit and then blending in the effect. For the hi-hat and the ride, no ducking is really needed. Their dynamics are so intertwined with the full instrument that trying to control them is kind of an exercise in futility, but some airy reverb dialed in, while in the context of the full mix, will give these tracks an actual purpose. Now, one important thing to note, and it almost goes without saying, is that you shouldn't over-reverberate unless you really want that type of sound. In the last step, we're going to add some bus processing that'll really amplify quieter details, reverb included, so use less reverb than what you'll want in the long run. Let's take a listen to the reverb being enabled and notice how it subtly fills the space and it keeps the transient detail intact. Last up, let's add some drum bus processing. So we're almost done. We just need to create a drum bus by changing all of the outputs of our tracks to a bus. On the corresponding auxiliary track, we'll introduce a plugin that maximizes the signal. My personal favorite is PSP Vintage Warmer 2. Increasing the knee, the processor automatically amplifies the track, introducing soft clipping and adding harmonics. Then I'll do some subtle tone shaping to emphasize the kick's fundamental and the snare's clarity. I'll switch the processing to multi to have the processing treat each range independently, and then I'm going to go into the settings to adjust the amount of saturation on each band and quicken the release times for the highs and the mids. Now, if you don't have this plugin, I'll also recommend the Oxford Limiter, Saturn II, or the Omnipressor. But of course, substitute whichever plugin that you trust to affect the full instrument. Then I'm going to add a mid-side EQ to shape the sound subtly. I'll make some of the lows mono with a side image high-pass filter and then widen the mids and the highs. On the mid image, I'll balance the lows, reducing some of the muddiness and increase the clarity a little more. For the sake of transparency, I also added the plugin Fresh Air at the end of the boundary kick, the snare top, and the high tom tracks to add some air and brighten the reverb. Let's listen one more time to the drums as I introduce the Vintage Warmer and then the final EQ. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. It's truly appreciated. And as I said at the beginning of the video, if you want to get the most out of your productions, check out our Sage Audio membership. When you sign up, you get 50 masters, access to our mixing, mastering, and pre-mastering courses with new videos being released each week, and one-on-one mentorship with Sage Audio engineers. In the community section, you can see how your mixes and your masters hold up by getting helpful feedback from us and your fellow engineers. If you need tracks to practice your mixing and mastering, you could download unmixed multi-track sessions, unmastered mixes, and find additional support with our mixing and mastering templates. We're adding more to the membership every week, so I definitely recommend signing up soon to get your 70% discount.